what's your approach when it comes to programming for athletic development? If you could take us through your thought process, where do you start from? And then how do you lay it down and kind of work through the details of it?
Oh yeah. So athletic development for me is interesting, right? Because it can't get more broad than that, right? Like, so I always look at task demands first, right? So I'm always looking at like, what's this client, like, what's this athlete's actual sport, right? Are they a power lifter? Are they a 100-meter runner? Are they a field sport athlete? Like, what are they doing? What are the task demands from a physical and physiological perspective? And even, like I said, a tactical perspective, if we're talking about like field sport athletes or basketball players or whatever, where being able to be reactive is a huge component of the sport itself and the demands on the sport, right? So when I start looking at that, I kind of identify, the 3 to 5 like major training components that I can help improve from my perspective, right? And then I look at the athlete themselves and look at their individual limiters, right? Because I might have an athlete who excels in some of those task demands, but has major discrepancies in others, right? So when I start looking at that, well, that gives me that helps me identify like what we need to focus on from a training perspective, right? Because if I'm working with like a basketball player, for instance, like I might have somebody who is incredibly strong, is very elastic, but has terrible work capacity. Well, their training program is going to look very different than somebody who has great work capacity, but gets boxed out of bounds every time a shot goes up. Right. And it needs like major strength training from that perspective. So at that point, like that's going to kind of dictate the terms of what I'm looking at from a microcycle and a mesocycle perspective. Whether or not they're in season or off season is also going to be dependent and really kind of dictate what the training looks like from that perspective. So when I look at that training, like the majority of my athletes, if we're talking off season training, because that's where I'm going to be more useful typically, I'm typically looking at like a 3-3 split where I'm looking at 3 strength training days and 3, more conditioning days. And I'm a big fan of, the old Charlie Francis, like high-low model. And even no conditioning days are going to be inherently lower stimulus typically than training days. Matt and I have kind of looked at moderating that because we have more strength and conditioning demands to like kind of high, moderate, low days. So a lot of what I look at on a microcycle perspective is if I'm looking at my strength days, my A days is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for example, and my conditioning days is my B days is Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm kind of going to lay it out as like that Monday day is probably going to be a high stimulus strength day. And then as I come into that B1, that Tuesday, I'm probably going to have a pretty moderate stimulus conditioning day where maybe I'm going through like some tempo running, some LICT work, something of that nature. And then on that Wednesday, I'm typically going to do a lower stimulus strength day, which for a lot of my running athletes especially ends up being like a higher stimulus upper body day, but a very low stimulus leg day to kind of save the legs. And then as I go through Thursday, that's where I'm going to give somebody a high stimulus conditioning day. And that's where we go through speed work, we go through acceleration work, we go through sprints, maybe finish it off with some HICT, like just power development stuff. And then on Friday, I'm going to kind of auto regulate that to a moderate to high strength day, depending on how they feel and how they recover. And then on Saturday, like that's their low and slow base development for their just aerobic capacity. And that's going to be a low stimulus conditioning day where we're focusing a lot on, depending on what the athlete demands are, GPP to just aerobic base, zone 2 stuff. And they can kind of work that as both a recovery and a low threshold aerobic day. And then they'll get, Sunday off to just kind of move around. And that's kind of a base that I'll start with people on. And then, as other outside variables creep up, we can modify it really easily if I have those pieces kind of in play.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned Charlie Francis, tempo runs, and basketball. How do you approach conditioning for a basketball player?
So when I'm talking off season, it depends on what they're doing for their actual sport too, right? If they're a collegiate athlete, like they're probably playing 3 to 5 times a week as well. So I also want to make sure that I'm managing like total load, right? For those people. So we might not do a ton of like base level aerobic work if that athlete's already doing a ton of playing over the course of it, we might focus more on like power development and like elasticity on some of those conditioning days, and maybe some like short work sprint stuff. So their conditioning days might actually be very short depending on what their total playing volume is. If they're doing stuff that's more like just one-on-one skill development work, and they're not doing a lot of like open gym work and kind of that kind of thing, then I can start looking at more of that middle tempo stuff, depending on what their needs are, where depending on what their contact is, like I'll typically use something that's a little lower contact for their kind of mid-level conditioning. Like I'll break out an assault bike, I'll do things of that nature, which will allow them to push physiological capabilities without incurring just a ton of like overuse force development, right? And kind of save their legs a little bit from that perspective, where we might have like some intensive and extensive pogos on other days, just to, again, maintain and develop elasticity. They'll be doing a lot of like their tempo work that's going to be, you know, anywhere 15 to 30 minute duration typically is what I give them. And I'll give them kind of continuous work with spikes. Like I'm a big fan of kind of looking at like a 30-90 split, where they're going to hit, you know, that 30-second at like a higher wattage, somewhere in that like 500 to 600 range. And then on that 90-second, they'll kind of float around 250, and we'll go 10 to 15 rounds of that, and just kind of work through occluding and dumping kind of through that process. And they might do that twice a week or something similar to that. And then we might have just like some LICT work, where they'll do something like they'll work with sleds, they'll work with, you know, pull sleds, prowlers, continuous step ups, like a lot of kind of Joel Jamieson protocol stuff. Big fan of that. So if they're lower volume playing, they'll do more of that, because typically the skill development stuff is just, you know, again, repeating pull-ups and things of that nature, where it's more skill invasive rather than like physically, you know, dependent.
What about the strength development? What's your approach on that front?
So with that, a lot of it has to do with, again, what their limiter actually is. And I'm going to use that to kind of determine like sets and reps. If I do have somebody who has a major strength limiter, and that's what's kind of holding back their ability to perform, then we will look at like global stimulus stuff. Like we will kind of work in some of that bigger bilateral stuff just to help them get under load and be able to accommodate that stimulus, right? And then we're going to kind of work into the accessory work, as far as that's where we'll get things that are a little more gait inspired. We'll get more unilateral work. We'll do things that are more reciprocal, both upper body and lower body. And that'll again, like just drive more movement demands, you know, that are going to be, replicatable from a basketball perspective. And if there's somebody who's not, strength limited, I'm probably going to bypass a lot of the sagittal bilateral work and get more into the unilateral stuff, because, right, so it's not like a squat's never going to truly replicate that. They're always going to be leaning into one leg, depending on, how fast they're running and what their own, force looks like. So even that, like the jumping there is still primarily one leg. So I do need to develop single leg strength, and then, just let them play their sport, and work the coordination into it from that perspective. So they'll be doing things like, again, both, depending again, like what their assessments are, FFEs and RFEs and different split squat variations, different lateral shifting, things of that nature. Like I'm a big fan of that, and post some things there, but a lot of it is going to essentially try to give them the ability to drive both IR and ER of the femur, and to be able to modulate both of those things, and control both of those things very well. Because especially that internal rotation, we start talking about like change of direction work and deceleration, like they need to have that yielding strategy, and they need to be able to internally rotate to create a stretch reflex powerful enough to externally rotate and extend out of, maybe that defensive slide, or that change of direction when the ball turns over or whatever, without having, excessive ground-based contact, or again, just injury risk at that point. So there's definitely things that, qualities that we can kind of train. We're never going to replicate the sport itself, but we can give people more options. And that's what I'm going to look to do from that perspective.
I'm really interested in what you're learning now in your master's work.